I know sometimes during this gardening season it might rain too much or it might be too hot to get out, but that doesn't mean that you can't still get out and do something for the garden. So we've got today a project that you can either do in a nice shady area, in your garden shed, or even in your garage or home. So the first thing that we're going to do is we are going to make a clay sphere. You can either do a full sphere or a half sphere, but you're going to need some clay pots in order to do that. Now we went with just a kind of a hobby craft pot because they're a little bit thinner, which means they're lighter weight, which is important when you're trying to put this actually into the garden. So this is a 4.5 inch, whereas this is a 2.5 inch. I will say the 2.5 inch is a little bit easier, but keep in mind anytime you're planting a smaller pot, that means there's going to be less root zone, and also it's going to dry out faster. So the 2.5 really works well for more of a succulent planting, whereas the 4.5 will allow you to do some different plants. And keep in mind, think about where you're going to put this. So again, obviously, if you're doing something with succulents, it's going to need to be in full sun as well. So the first thing that you're going to need is you're going to need 41 pots. And so that's a fair amount of pots. If you go with the smaller, obviously it's cheaper. These come in a nice 6-pack, so you can get several of them that way. And what we're going to do is we're going to lay out these pots in a fashion in a circle. It sort of helps to do a little bit of a dry run first, but you're going to need 11 pots in that first circle. So it obviously helps to work on a very flat surface because these pots tend to want to roll a little bit, and you might need a few extra hands just to kind of help stabilize it as well. And then we worked with the next row, and you kind of place that second row nestled in between that first row. So it kind of filled in those valleys between those pots. And we found that 8 pots worked the best on that. And then you have a hole at the top, which you've got to fill to complete your sphere. So we found that 3 pots sort of worked well. Now keep in mind, you are going to still have gaps, especially depending on what pots you're working with. The holes will vary between those clay pots, but that's okay. That's why we have plants to kind of fill in and cover some of the ugliness and also the glue. So once you've done a dry run and you're pleased with how it looks, again, it's going to be very unstable until you glue it. Go ahead and make sure you've counted how many you have on each of those rings so that you can replicate it, deconstruct it, and then this time you're going to glue it. So we have found that some sort of outdoor strong bonding adhesive caulk works really well. You're going to need more glue than you think, so don't buy just a small tube. Go ahead and get a whole caulk gun, especially if you're doing the larger pots. And so you're going to want to glue as you go, as you build each ring. So building the first ring of 11, glue those together. You can go ahead and glue the next row. You don't have to wait for it to dry. And then finally put in your top 3. Now keep in mind, again, as you're gluing this, they're going to shift a little bit. So where they might have been connected with glue, they might not as you finish that. So you want to go back through with glue and kind of fill in some more of those cracks where they're connecting and touching to make sure that they're well bonded. And then of course, once you've got it glued, you're going to let it set for a good period of time. Depending on which type of glue, there's a recommended level or recommended time to allow it to set. But let it set and make sure that it's well dried before you do anything further with it at that point. Now you might find that once you've gotten half of your sphere completed that it was a bit of a struggle with that process. So you might think, let's call it, that's good, and that's okay. So you can use just a half sphere. In fact, this larger clay pot, that's what we're intending. We're just going to place this out in the garden. Now, if you want to do a full sphere, what you're going to do is do the similar pattern, although you're going to leave out these top 3 pots. And let me show you why. So here we've got a full sphere, and you can see it is planted already, but I'm going to go ahead and lift this up. We didn't actually glue it to the bottom sphere so that you can see. We've got our 2 rings, but we didn't actually plant or glue 3 more rings to the inside of that. And that allows that sphere to really set really well on a flat surface. So you can see I had 2 half spheres. I didn't put the 3 in the center there, and that allows us to use it as a nice place to set that way. So this is a good thing. You can make it a sphere and not glue it to the top part, and then you can still use this as a centerpiece on a table, or you can put it out in your garden as a decorative piece as well. So we're going to go ahead and put this back, and I'm going to show you now how to go about planting your clay pot. So we've got this larger one here that we're going to go ahead and plant. You can see it's nice and dry. Now you can see some of our clay pots are a little bit unlevel. We've got holes. We're going to fill those. You can see on the smaller one what we used was some sphagnum moss just to fill, just to sort of give it some time as those sedums grow in. Now, one thing to keep in mind, especially if you're doing the sphere, maybe use some trailing things down, because you're not going to be able to plant these lower clay pots because they're actually upside down. So it's really hard to keep anything in there. But by planting trailing plants, that will kind of cover that base a little bit more. So on this particular one, we're planning on putting it in our shade garden. So we've got some shade tolerant plants versus the succulent one that you have here next to us. And so we're going to need some potting soil to fill in some of those holes. So we're going to go ahead and put a little bit in each one of these to get us started. So we have a variety of different plants that we're using, and I will say these like smaller quart size will probably fit the best in here. However, we worked with what we had, and so we also found some sedges to add a little bit to cover some of those areas that might not be so pretty. So we've got different colors of foliage with our sedges, and then we've also got a nice autumn fern here that I think we'll be able to shave down the roots on that. We've got a few more begonias we're going to add in here, and then also some holly ferns as well. So a lot of foliage, because this is again going to be a shade feature that we put in our shade garden. So we're going to start off sort of like flower arranging right now. We have several of these holly ferns, so we're going to start off with that. Again, these are sort of these like quart size. So we're going to go ahead and shave off a little bit of this soil. And then we're just going to sort of nestle these in somewhere around periodically throughout. If you do happen to come across any damaged leaves, go ahead and clean those out like you would any other garden or any other plant. You can see what it looks like once you finally got it finished. It's definitely worth the patience and kind of the craftiness of being able to construct it and giving it time to dry and then finally planting it. Now again, this is filled with plants. You wouldn't even necessarily have to plant each container because it's kind of nice to see some of those clay pots exposed. However, we did plant every one of them here. And so you can see how all of this foliage really covers some of those oopses that you might have had during your construction process. When you're designing this, it's sort of like a flower arrangement. So you're going to start with your greenery. We started with this holly fern and just sort of placed it periodically throughout this semicircle here. And then we went in with some of the sedges. So we have this sort of golden sedge and then also the variegated sedge. Again, kind of putting those sporadically throughout and making sure that you're not putting any two right next to each other. So you got that color throughout. Finally, we went in with this little punch of bright pink in there from this shade begonia. Again, adding those pops of color, but it's definitely worth the process. And what's nice about this is you'll be able to use it from season to season, whether it's annuals or perennials. So now we just need to find that perfect place to put it in the garden.
We hope you enjoyed this video. It's part of our Oklahoma Gardening YouTube channel. You can also find even more videos on our OK Gardening Classics YouTube channel. And join us on social media for great gardening tips, photos, and discussion.